gonna be another debunking video. However, this time I thought I would just take a look at some of the most classical arguments that you hear from climate change deniers or climate change skeptics. This is not going to be the most comprehensive or detailed debunking when it comes to these claims. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the most general claims that I hear, and I'm going to do a very general and basic debunking. And I will probably look into these specific claims into more detail in future videos and do even deeper debunkings. But right now, this is just supposed to be kind of a surface layer debunking of these very general statements and claims. Anyway, let's begin. Claim number 1. If you look at the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, it was actually a lot higher in the past at multiple times compared to today, and life thrived back then. Therefore, a higher temperature now is not really of any concern. Okay, so this claim is not necessarily really a denial claim of climate change. Rather, it's more of a skeptical kind that I would say. It's basically trying to make the argument that, hey, maybe it's not going to be that bad that the atmosphere gets warmer. And you know what? This is actually a bit of a half-truth. Yes, technically speaking, a warmer atmosphere per se is not really a problem at all. It is perfectly true that in the past, I mean, we're talking like a long time in the past, the atmosphere was way hotter than it is now. And I mean a lot hotter than now. And yes, life thrived back then, just like it does now. You see, the problem isn't really that the atmosphere is getting cold or warm per se. It's the rate at which the atmosphere, on average, gets colder or warmer. The Earth's temperature has been a lot colder, and it's also been a lot warmer in the past. But those changes happened over long time periods. Ice ages, for instance, happen the fastest on the scales of tens of thousands of years. Yes, when it comes to ice ages, you have to wait tens of thousands of years at least before you start to notice these big temperature changes. And that's considered fast on geological timescales. Now, what do you call it when you see, exactly when you see over 1 Celsius degree change in just 100 years? This is not just a fast change in a geological timescale. It's more or less instant. The Earth's temperature is warming at about 10 times faster now than in previous periods in the past where the Earth's atmosphere has gotten warmer. There's a pretty big difference in terms of how ecosystems across the world reacts when you have a warming that takes 1,000 years and you have the same warming that only takes 100 years. The difference is, in one case, the ecosystem might just be able to adapt in time. In the other case, there's no chance in hell that the ecosystem is actually going to be able to adapt. So it's not really the temperature change in of itself that is the problem with climate change. It's the fact that the ecosystems where the warming is going to be the most extreme don't have time to adapt. This will lead to ecological collapses across the world. Now, I do want to point out, though, that I am sick and tired of the polar opposites of climate change deniers. Basically, the people who are what I would call hysterics. People who claim that, climate change is going to lead to an apocalypse and humanity is going to die, which is simply not true. Even in the worst case scenario of climate change, it's still not going to be an apocalypse. It is still going to be very bad, however, and it will lead to several species of plants and animals going extinct, which is not a good thing. Our agriculture would have to change as well, and in fact, a lot of the things that we enjoy to eat may actually disappear or become way more infrequent. So yeah, just to summarize this point, the problem isn't really the warming per se. The problem is the rate at which the atmosphere is warming. It's happening too fast for the ecosystems across the world to adapt in time. Anyway, let's move on. Claim number 2. CO2 is plant food. And since CO2 levels today are lower than they were during the time of the dinosaurs, for instance, plants are actually now starving. Plants need CO2, so more CO2 just means more plant food. Therefore, plants should grow better, and then they will capture more CO2, and the problem of a higher CO2 level will solve itself. Okay, so here's the problem. You're comparing a controlled environment, which is a greenhouse, to plants in the wild. You see, in a greenhouse, you have more or less a cut-off ecosystem within the greenhouse. The only thing you really let in, for the most part, into a greenhouse from the outside is the sun's rays. Anything else doesn't really usually penetrate into the greenhouse, nor does anything else within the greenhouse usually leave the greenhouse. You see, when it comes to the plants in the greenhouse, you can control pretty much everything regarding their existence. You can control how much water they have, you can control what kind of soil they have, you can control the amount of nitrogen that is given to them. And that's why people who operate greenhouses can actually do things like artificially increase the CO2 levels in the greenhouse to stimulate plant growth and activity. However, a higher level of CO2 in the atmosphere at large is not necessarily, or even in most cases, gonna help plants grow in the wild. The reason is, the wild is a place where, well, water is a lot less secure. Nitrogen is not as secure. The type of soil is not as secure. Plants in the wild doesn't have people making sure they get enough nitrogen, or have the proper soil, or have enough water, let's say. You see, with a higher level of CO2, yes, technically plants can absorb more CO2 and grow, but this is only in theory. And again, in a controlled environment, you can definitely make that happen. But in the wild, it's a different story. You see, leaves take in CO2 from the atmosphere through something called their stomata. It's a tiny little opening that lets in the CO2 molecules. The problem is, plants do this passively. There is no real active process to capture CO2. And what this means is that the only way for them to capture the CO2 is to keep the stomata open. But by doing so, they also risk losing water molecules through evaporation through these stomatas. And as we all know, water evaporates more when there's a hotter temperature outside. And as the global average temperature increases, guess what? More water is going to be evaporated through the leaves of these plants. The only way for plants to really fight back against the loss of water is to keep their stomata open during fewer hours of the day. This means that they also capture less CO2. So for the vast majority of plants in the world, it's actually estimated that they're gonna take up less CO2 due to the higher temperatures. Now, this is not true for all plants, naturally. There will be a couple of plants that actually will benefit, but overall, in general, on average, most plants will actually take up less CO2. Yes, CO2 levels were higher back during the time of the dinosaurs, but you also had different types of plants back then. Modern plants have evolved to deal with CO2 levels that are, within the range of maybe 200 parts per million or something like that. Not over 400 parts per million, which is what we have now. The evolution of plants simply cannot keep up with the rate at which CO2 levels are changing. Anyway, let's go on. Claim number 3. Scientists used to talk about global cooling back in the 70s, and then all of a sudden, when it became politically expedient, they started to change it to global warming or climate change. Okay, this is one of the most pernicious claims from climate change deniers or skeptics that I've seen, and to this day it's definitely something that is usually just spammed in comment sections or just claimed in videos from climate change deniers or skeptics over and over again without any attempt of fact-checking whatsoever. Now, I've already made a very detailed video on this subject. You will find it linked below. In that video, I debunk this claim just very thoroughly. No, climate scientists in the 70s did not say, for the most part, that we were heading to a global cooling event. This is a lie. If you look at the actual peer-reviewed published papers on climate change between the years of 1965 to 1979, what you find is that about 62% of the papers presented predicted a warming event. So already back in the 1960s, the vast majority of climate scientists were in agreement. The Earth is heading to a warming event, not a cooling event. Stop taking advice on climate change from people like Penn Jillette and start to listen to actual climate researchers. Claim number 4. No research showed any warming whatsoever in Earth's atmosphere until very recently. Obviously, all the data must be staged. This is one of the more extreme claims that I hear from climate change deniers. And it's just absolutely absurd because you can look at publicly available data and see that no, recorded temperatures show a warming going back over 100 years. But I think the best way to argue against these people is to simply just show them that even the oil companies in the 1970s and 80s knew that releasing CO2 into the atmosphere would lead to a global warming event. Yes, oil companies like Shell actually knew the science of climate change and how their industry was contributing and causing the rate of warming to increase exponentially already back in the 1970s and 80s. Trust me, some of these released documents are quite an interesting read, and I would suggest everyone to read on these. And I would suggest anyone who is denying this to read these documents for themselves. Alright, anyway, that's going to be enough for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
With it for a little while now. You want to get to the climate change thing, because you just read a book I wrote several years ago.
Yeah.
Which has an attack at someone who attacked me on climate change. I think that there's no way you can deny that there's climate change. I've completely changed on that. Although completely changed is a little bit confusing because I never went beyond, I don't know.
Yeah.
What bothers me about the climate change thing was the great disservice done by Al Gore of exaggerating.
Yeah, no, it's always...
We have to scare people. You have to do this. And I hate the fact that style affected me, but the kind of people who were talking about it were the kind of people that were so dismissive of people that I loved that I bridled.
You had an emotional reaction.
It was very, very emotional.